Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. In case you're new here, my name's Jennifer. Today we're continuing a series that we started a couple weeks ago where I'm really looking back on my 2023 garden and making plans for what I'm going to keep the same and what I'm going to do differently next year. This video is really going to be focused on what I'm going to do differently next year. Now, every gardening year, the hope is that we learn a few lessons. Now, it's not always fun to go through the process of learning those lessons, but the knowledge that we gain from experiences in gardening that sometimes do well and sometimes don't can definitely help us succeed more next year. And so that is what this video is focused on. I'm going to be talking about some things that maybe did not do so well this year in the garden and how I am going to work to make them better next year. So just a little caveat before we really get into the things that I want to change for next year is that this is kind of what I'm thinking as of right now. Okay, my rooster has some opinions about that. None of this is set in stone. This is what I'm thinking and planning right now, but I do reserve the right to change my mind on any of this. But that being said, let's dive into the things that I'm planning to change for next year's garden. The first thing that I want to change is that I'm planning on growing my peppers exclusively in pots. I have found throughout the years that peppers just thrive in pots, at least for me in my garden. And I have experimented the past couple years with trying to grow some of them in the ground, hoping that that will increase the amount of peppers I'm able to grow. Honestly, my in-ground peppers really haven't been thriving the way my potted peppers do. So I find that they're taking up a lot of valuable garden space that I could be allotting to something else, while the peppers on my deck in pots are thriving. So what I plan to do is increase the number of peppers that I'm growing on my deck, and I probably most likely won't grow any peppers in ground in the garden next year. One thing that change does is it frees up some growing space. Now, this past growing season, if you're familiar with my garden, if you've been watching my garden tours or watching my garden as the season goes on, you know that I like to grow my tomatoes on a trellis down the middle of my raised bed. And that leaves a lot of space on either side of the tomato plants. So what I had been doing was growing my peppers in front of the tomato plants where they'll have access to the most sunlight. But since I'm not going to be doing that next year, I'm going to be moving them all to my deck. That gives me some extra space in front of my tomato plants. So I am still coming up with some ideas for what I plan to grow there. I'm thinking about things like zucchini, I'm thinking about squash, I'm thinking about pumpkins, maybe watermelon. If you have any suggestions for other things that you would put in that space, definitely go ahead and let me know that, because at this point I'm kind of in the brainstorming phase when it comes to that. I'm open to all kinds of suggestions. So those are just some things that I'm thinking of. So since we kind of segued from peppers into tomatoes, I'll just stay in the tomato vein for a little bit. And there's a couple changes that I want to make regarding how I grow my tomatoes next year. The first is that if you have followed along with me for any length of time, you know that I love growing a variety of tomatoes. I just love to have that beautiful variety in my harvest basket where I have all different colors of tomatoes, all different sizes, shapes, flavors. I just love that variety. And I still do love that variety. But I think that with our current goals for the garden, I think that I need to make a little bit of a change. While I will still grow a nice variety of tomatoes, I do want to grow a few more, more production varieties. There were several varieties I grew this year that performed really well for me, so I'm going to increase the number of those varieties that I'm growing next year in the hopes of getting more tomatoes for things like preserving. I will still grow a variety of beautiful colored slicers. I love heirloom tomatoes and all the varieties that they come in, but I'm kind of thinking along the same lines of trying to expand my tomato production. I think I may add a hybrid variety or two into the mix. So that being said, I pretty much grow exclusively heirloom tomatoes because I love them. So I'm not really familiar with a lot of hybrid varieties. If you have some great hybrid varieties you want to recommend, I would love to hear your recommendations. So I'm thinking probably a red slicer and possibly another colored slicer as well. If you have any recommendations for plants that produce a lot, are disease resistant, produce for a long length of time, ideally I would like something that produces as close to frost as possible, and still has amazing flavor. I know, sounds like I'm asking for a unicorn there, but if you have anything along those lines, I would love to hear your recommendations. One other change that I'm planning to make next year is to grow fewer cucumber varieties. This year, I think I grew 7 or 8 cucumber varieties. It was the most cucumber varieties that I've ever grown. And while that was fun, I found that there's really just a couple cucumber varieties that just outperform the rest by a mile and that we really loved. So I'm thinking next year I'm probably going to downsize to, I was going to say 2 main varieties. I think I'm going to stick with the Silver Slicer and the Homemade Pickles pickling cucumber. But my son really does love snacking on the lemon cucumber too. So I think I'll probably grow 1 or 2 plants of the lemon cucumber. And then I'm going to grow, aside from that one, I'm just going to stick with those couple tried and true cucumber varieties. I found that there were a lot of varieties I tried this year that seemed really fun and just seemed like they would add some great variety and interest. And while they were fun, they didn't produce anywhere near the amount that our other cucumbers produced. And we just really preferred those varieties. So next year, I'm going to really just focus on growing those 2 main varieties plus the 1 extra variety for snacking. Now, kind of along these same lines, I'm also thinking I'm probably going to grow fewer pepper varieties next year. Now, don't worry, my garden will still be fun and exciting. I am still going to have a lot of variety. But I found that I experimented this year, and to some extent last year too, with some kind of, I guess I'll call them like novelty pepper varieties. But I found that what I really wanted was more of the peppers that we use a lot. We use a lot of jalapenos and we use a lot of bell peppers. Now, this year, I didn't grow very many bell peppers because bell peppers really have not historically produced very much for me. But what I found was that the Corno de Toro pepper is a great bell pepper substitute. So what I'm planning to do next year is to decrease the number of varieties of peppers we're growing. I'm sure I will still grow a couple more varieties besides what I just mentioned. But I want to increase the number of jalapenos that we're growing and the number of Corno de Toros. Now, this year I grew both the yellow variety and the red variety of Corno de Toro. I did a little bit of research and I found that there is an orange variety that exists as well. So I may try to find seeds for that one and add that into my rotation. If you are familiar with the orange Corno de Toro variety, I know it's a lot less common than the other 2. But if you have any experience with it or know anything about it, I would love to hear from you about that one. But as of right now, you know, probably over the winter, I'll get my seed catalogs and I'll find some other amazing pepper varieties that I want to grow. But for the most part, I'm thinking that I'm going to focus most of my growing space on those varieties that I mentioned. One other change that I'm planning to make next year, and this will be a little bit of an experiment, is to start some winter squash early in pots in my house. Now, it has been my experience that for the most part, squash really does prefer to be direct sown. Now, when it comes to summer squash, I've grown zucchini many years, and I've found that far and away, my direct sown zucchini outperforms zucchini that I've started inside. So the past few years, I haven't even bothered starting any zucchini plants early. I've just stuck seeds in the ground, and those zucchini plants do great. But when it comes to winter squash, I've only been growing winter squash for the past couple years, and I found that they just take so much longer to mature that last year, I don't think I got any, maybe I got 1 winter squash actually to maturity. And this year, I may get 1 or 2. I probably won't get very many. It kind of depends on how long our frost holds off. But I think that I would like to try starting some winter squash and maybe some pumpkins inside in pots to give them a little bit of a boost. And that's going to be kind of an experiment. So what I may end up doing is start a few of those early in pots and still direct sow some as well, so I can do a little bit of a side-by-side comparison. If that's anything that you've done as well, I would love to hear your experience with that too. Because as I said, squash doesn't like its roots disturbed, so for the most part, it's been my practice to direct sow it. But if I'm growing winter squash and it needs a little bit of a longer time to grow, I may have no choice but to start it inside. So I'm planning to experiment with that next year. So another change that I'm considering making is possibly not having a dedicated lettuce and greens bed next year. In my main raised bed garden, I have one bed that I've consistently used every year. It's in kind of the shadiest corner of my garden, so I have consistently used that for growing lettuces and greens and things that are a little bit more shade tolerant. They've done really well and thrived there. But what I was thinking, I'm kind of still playing around with this idea and fleshing it out, so again, I would love to hear input on this too. As I mentioned, I grow my tomatoes on a trellis in a single row down the middle of my raised beds. And what that means is that there's a side behind the tomatoes that doesn't get a lot of sun. And I was playing around with the idea of using that back part of the lettuce beds to grow lettuce and greens. I experimented with growing some other types of plants in that spot this year. And while they did okay, they didn't do as well as they could have if they had more sun. So what I'm kind of toying around with is the idea of putting all the lettuce behind the tomatoes and then using that lettuce bed for something else. Possibly something like some broccoli or some more brassicas that doesn't need as much sun, but would still appreciate more sun than it would get behind the tomatoes. So the sun is coming out and getting right in my eyes and probably making a really bright video for you guys too. So we're going to shift location. All right, I think this is a little better for me. So hopefully this is better for you guys too. So as I was saying, I'm considering turning my current dedicated lettuce bed into possibly more of a brassica bed or something along those lines. Now, my family loves broccoli and cauliflower and kale and all those brassicas. So right now I have 2 whole beds dedicated to those plants. But honestly, we could really use more broccoli in our lives. So I'm considering turning that lettuce bed into possibly another broccoli bed. I may play around with throwing some other plants in there as well. That's still something that I'm kind of figuring out, but that's kind of what I'm leaning towards at the moment. So the final change that I am planning to make, or at least that I'm going to talk about in this video, also deals with repurposing garden beds. Now, we're over here in the side yard garden. This garden is completely new this year, so this is all expanded extra growing space for me, and I am loving it. Now, I have to the side, you can't really see it over here, I have an 8x4 foot raised bed that I am planning to grow my garlic in. Now, we built this garden in the spring, and in my area, garlic gets planted in the fall. So we have not planted any garlic over here yet. So I grew basically a hodgepodge, all kinds of random plants in that bed for this year. But we're coming up on fall now, or we're in fall. We're coming up on garlic planting season, I should say. In this area, I usually plant my garlic in November. So what's going to happen is this bed is going to get planted out all in garlic. And that's going to double my garlic growing space, which that alone is really exciting. But the other thing that that's going to do is it's going to free up a little mini 4x4 foot raised bed that I have in my main garden to grow something else. So again, I have to come up with something else to grow in that space. What I'm leaning towards right now is possibly growing some Roma tomatoes in that space. Now, Milo came over to say hi, as you can see his black tail on the screen there. So as I mentioned, I am wanting to grow more tomatoes for production. I would really like to be able to preserve more tomatoes. So I'm thinking of filling that bed with some small plants, some determinate Roma tomatoes of some variety, and just dedicating those all to preserving. Now, I realize a 4 foot by 4 foot bed is not going to give me a lot of tomatoes for preserving space. It's not going to give me a lot of space to grow a lot of preserving tomatoes, but it will give me enough to at least be able to freeze a few batches of roasted tomato soup, maybe a few batches of roasted salsa, something along those lines. And I think that something like that we would really enjoy over the winter months when we are without a garden. So that's what I'm leaning towards putting in that garlic space. If you have any suggestions, again, I'm open to all kinds of suggestions. So I would love to hear what you guys think. So that's my quick little summary of what I want to change, or my garden regrets, I guess, of the 2023 garden. I am really looking forward to the 2024 garden. As much as I don't want the 2023 garden to die and, just to be without a garden for a few months, the end of every garden season still is hopeful because it allows you to think about what you do differently, and it allows you to make plans for the next year's garden. I am so excited about that. I can't wait to plan my 2024 garden with you guys. So I hope that you join me again as we recap more of the 2023 garden. I've also got some really exciting projects planned for the fall and winter when we unfortunately won't have a garden to talk about. So I hope that you guys are having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.